Alice Stokes Paul dedicated her life to the notion of what she called ordinary equality. She was born at Paulsdale, her family's farm in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, on January 11, 1885. Her parents, William Paul and Tacy Parry Paul, both came from a long Quaker heritage. Alice attended meeting at the Society of Friends, or Quakers, in neighboring Moorestown, and embraced Quaker principles in her life's work for civil rights. Her life clearly exemplifies three key Quaker principles: equality among all people, an obligation to actively right social injustice, and a commitment to a nonviolent life. As a student at Moorestown Friends High School, Alice was a serious and shy young woman who loved to read. Her shy demeanor, however, did not stop her from participating in school activities such as field hockey, tennis, basketball, and baseball. She graduated first in her class in 1901 and went on to Swarthmore College to study biology. Following college graduation in 1905, Alice, like many young educated Quaker women, entered the new field of social work, moving to New York City to help immigrants there. However, she was soon convinced that social work was not a lasting solution for these impoverished men and women. By 1908, Alice's greatest ambition was to be a college professor. She traveled to England to attend the London School of Economics. When she lost out on a fellowship that would have paid for her graduate education, she had to abandon this plan. This was a turning point in her life, a moment when she had to recast her future. She came to the cause of women's suffrage when she saw Christabel Pankhurst heckled and forced off stage during a speech for women's right to vote. Alice was galvanized by the idea of equality through political representation, and soon after that night joined the Pankhursts, mother Emmeline and daughters Christabel and Sylvia. The Pankhursts' motto, "Deeds, not words," meant everything from speaking on street corners to participating in suffrage parades to throwing rocks and ultimately even to being arrested. The deeds were extreme, but ensured that the suffrage message was heard. Alice was sent to English prisons 3 times for her participation in the movement. While in prison, she went on hunger strike and had to endure painful forced feedings. She would later describe these feedings in detail, but upon her release from jail in late November 1909, Alice sent a series of reassuring letters to her mother as the Christmas holidays approached. In early January, she sent a different type of letter to her mother, saying that the doctor told her she should be able to walk tomorrow. It was the first indication to her mother that Alice had been bedridden for over a month. She then described the forced feedings.
They usually tied me down by a sheet around the abdomen, by another around the lungs. It is impossible to get a good breath. One of the doctors stood behind and pulled my head back till it was parallel with the ground. He held it in this position by means of a towel drawn tightly around the throat. The other doctor put the tube down through the nostril. Then they poured the milk and liquid food into a funnel at the top of the tube. While the tube is going through the nasal passage, it is exceedingly painful, and only less so as it is being withdrawn.
Determined to make a difference in the American suffrage movement, she enrolled in the University of Pennsylvania and completed a master's degree in social work, and then followed this in 1912 with a doctorate in economics. During this time, she introduced to the Pennsylvania suffrage movement bold new demonstration tactics, such as soapbox speeches and mass open-air events, all from the Pankhurst playbook. Alice proved herself an innovative organizer and tactician in 1913 when she became chair of the Congressional Committee, a branch of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to work for an amendment to the Constitution to give women the vote. Her counterpart in this work was Lucy Burns, a feisty young American lawyer whom she met in an English police station. In less than 3 months, the two organized a procession of over 8,000 men and women to march in Washington, D.C. in support of the women's vote. The parade was held on March 3, 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, to gain maximum publicity for the suffrage movement. The procession attracted a huge crowd. As the marchers turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, onlookers crowded the streets, preventing the parade from advancing. Hecklers tore at the marchers' banners and shouted at them to go home. Police did little to control the mounting chaos. The next morning, the parade and the riot, and more importantly, women's suffrage, were front-page news across the country. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns led several deputations of women to speak with President Wilson on suffrage. Each time, he dismissed these groups, stating that suffrage was a state, not a federal issue. After several differences of opinion on tactics and strategy, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns left NASA and launched the National Woman's Party, or NWP. From across the country, the NWP rapidly gained members and subscribers to their publication, The Suffragist. In 1916, President Wilson urged suffragists to stop their work in order to support America's war efforts in Europe. While many other women's organizations complied, Alice Paul refused, on the grounds that it was now more important than ever to have democracy at home before committing American lives to fight for democracy abroad. In January of 1917, the NWP launched a very bold new campaign to picket the White House. They stood at the president's front gate for most of that year through a harsh winter, spring storms, and the heat of summer. The Silent Sentinels, or Iron-Jawed Angels as one disgruntled senator called them, stood at the gates of the White House until November 1917, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. In June, a group of young soldiers attacked the women for what they believed was unpatriotic behavior. After a scuffle, nearby police rushed in and arrested the women on the charge of obstructing traffic. Every day over the next several weeks, groups of picketers were arrested and sent to workhouses, jails, and mental asylums, all on the charge of obstructing traffic. Altogether, 168 suffragists went to jail between June and November of 1917. Several of them served more than one sentence. Imprisoned, the suffragists were fed rotten food, slept on hard stone floors, and endured filthy conditions. Alice joined the imprisoned suffragists in October, and soon after, she and the other women began a hunger strike. If any of the women died, it would lead to a political nightmare for the Wilson administration. Prison authorities initiated painful forced feedings 3 times a day. The tube feeding was a torture Alice knew well from her experience in England, yet she chose to endure it because she believed so strongly in her cause. Alice was separated from the group by prison officials and put into solitary confinement. To discredit her, a psychiatrist was supposed to declare her insane. Instead, after a long interview with her, he reported that Alice Paul was perfectly sane in every respect. On the evening of November 14, 1917, a date suffragists called the Night of Terror, prison guards subjected incoming prisoners to violent beatings. News of the forced feedings and violence inflicted on the suffragists leaked out to newspapers and pressured the president to unconditionally release them. Leaving prison, Alice declared,
"The government has used its heaviest weapon, and we have won."
An NWP mass meeting in December 1917 honored all 168 women who served time in jail with a Jailed for Freedom pin. In January of 1918, President Wilson publicly announced his support of women's suffrage, and the House of Representatives immediately endorsed the women's suffrage amendment. It took several more months of open-air meetings, demonstrations, and forceful lobbying by the NWP to convince the Senate to pass the amendment. The NWP lit watchfires and kept them burning in front of the White House and in Lafayette Park until the required 36 states ratified the suffrage amendment. Tennessee, the last state needed, ratified it by 1 vote cast by the youngest member of the legislature, Harry Burns. The night before the vote, Burns received specific instructions from his mother. "Harry, do right by the ladies and put the rat in ratification." The 19th Amendment became law on August 26, 1920, today known as Women's Equality Day. Alice Paul's work, however, was far from over. She wanted to ensure that women were protected from discrimination and outlined a new focus on women's equality for the National Woman's Party. The NWP supported female political candidates with the Women for Congress campaign and also worked to support women's citizenship and employment rights. Alice Paul earned her law degree from American University in 1928. Her legal knowledge helped her to compose and advocate the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, which was introduced into Congress in 1923 and was reintroduced every session until it passed both houses in 1972. In 1938, Alice Paul founded the World Women's Party and traveled to Geneva, Switzerland to lobby the League of Nations to include an equal rights clause in its charter. She met daily with European diplomats to discuss the issue of gender equality. While in Geneva, as World War II approached, Alice Paul rescued several Jewish activists and intellectuals, making her Swiss villa a haven for them until they could secure safe passage out of Europe. Following the war, Alice Paul was instrumental in including gender equality in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. She also campaigned to include gender equality in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is, even today, the only federal protection against gender discrimination in the workplace. Alice Paul officially retired from the National Woman's Party in 1972 and moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut. After suffering a stroke, newspapers reported on her poor condition. Quaker meetings near Alice's childhood home raised money to move Alice Paul to the Greenleaf Nursing Home in Moorestown in 1976. At the Greenleaf, though in failing health, Alice received guests and actively lobbied for the ERA's passage. She made every guest promise to contact their legislators to advocate for the amendment. Alice Paul died on July 9, 1977, at the age of 92. She is buried next to her parents at Westfield Friends Meeting in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. In 1982, the Equal Rights Amendment fell 3 states short of the 38 required for ratification as an amendment to the Constitution. Alice Paul's dream of the ERA has yet to be realized. Alice Paul inspires us to continue in her footsteps and fight for what she called ordinary equality. In 1995, the Alice Paul Institute purchased Paulsdale in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and restored the home not as a house museum, but as a heritage and leadership center for women and girls. The Alice Paul Institute promotes the story of this inspiring civil rights leader and the stories of numerous other women missing from our history books. Heritage programs at Paulsdale encourage boys and girls to learn about women in history, the importance of Alice Paul's work, and much more. The Alice Paul Leadership Program encourages a new generation of Alice Pauls, young girls guided by female role models to make the world a better place. School-based day and week-long programs, events, and overnight programs at Paulsdale teach girls the skills they need to become leaders. We believe, as Alice Paul did, that inspiring men and women to work towards equality is a cause worth dedicating yourself to. Alice herself explained this best when, reflecting on her life, she explained,
I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality.